Welcome to Chapter 7. At this point in the program planning process, we're going to review Chapter 7 primarily to help you identify a theory and or model to use in developing the interventions for your program plan. So although this is a lengthy and pretty dense chapter, we're going to go through it and select some specific models and concepts to talk about to help guide your program planning process. So just to begin with thinking about what theories actually are, they're really helpful because they give us a systematic way of examining situations so that we can explain and predict happenings in life. And in health education and promotion, we use theories to explain and predict human behavior, especially in terms of adopting and adhering to healthy behaviors. In the program planning process, we apply well-studied theories and we use models to help set a framework for a plan. This gives us an evidence-based process where we use the evidence from previous research. This application helps us to identify why people are not already behaving in healthy ways. It provides a basis for selecting and developing our interventions. It provides insights into how to best deliver the interventions. And finally, it helps us identify what needs to be measured so that we can evaluate the impact of our interventions. So theories are used generally to help structure both the overall planning process and the details of the program activities. By using this theory-based approach, programmers have a solid basis for making choices and structuring the evaluation process. Funders really want to see that programs have a theoretical basis, that they are evidence-based. And using theory from research is how we do that. So there are both planning theories, which were discussed in Chapter 3, and behavior change theories, which is the primary topic of this chapter. And this comes from behavioral research, which is a branch of psychology. So current thinking is that successful programs for health promotion use a socio-ecological approach or an ecological perspective. And this is an approach that understands that behaviors have multiple levels of influence. We start with what are called intra and or interpersonal levels, and then finally a socio or a sociological and cultural context surrounding those intra and interpersonal levels. You've probably learned about the social ecological model in previous courses. So the sociocultural context is defined as the forces that shape people's day-to-day experiences that directly and indirectly affect health and behavior. Certain theories are more useful in developing programs aimed at specific levels of influence. But overall, what is being promoted primarily today are cross-cutting interventions, meaning crossing over various levels of influence, and those are proving to be the most effective. So this chart and diagram simply give you some of the concepts around the social ecological theory for behavior change. So looking at the intrapersonal level, or in some situations it's called the individual level, this is where we look at individual characteristics that influence behavior, such as knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, and personality traits. The interpersonal level then begins to form the shell or the next level that surrounds the individual. So interpersonal processes include groups that are influential, family members, friends, social networks, and it helps people to provide their social identity and support, but it also has a pretty strong influence on their behaviors. Then we look at the community level. These are the outer shells, organizations, social institutions, communities and relationships between organizations, and finally the outer layer is the public policies in which we live. For example, a big one that's changed recently in the state of New Hampshire is the legalization of medical marijuana. And that is a policy that's changing people's behaviors and attitudes around the use of marijuana as a medical therapy. So if we start with the intrapersonal level and look at behavior change theories, there are two major types of theories. Collectively, at the intrapersonal level, we are, as I mentioned before, looking at knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, self-concept, feelings, past experiences, motivation, basic skills, and behaviors. Some theories use a continuum approach, that is, that they look at variables that influence actions and combine them into a prediction equation. In other words, giving an idea of an if this, then that idea for behavior. There are also a cluster of theories called stage theories, and they have an ordered set of categories into which people can be classified. And those categories allow us to identify factors that could induce or stimulate movement or change from one category or one stage into the next stage. My favorite among these is the trans-theoretical model. And I've also learned more recently about the precaution adoption process, and a stage theory called the community readiness for change model is being used in community settings now. So if we start with just a really simple and basic individual or interpersonal level of theory, it's the good old stimulus response theory. This is where association between a behavior and an immediately following reward is sufficient to increase the probability that the behavior will be repeated. We use this an awful lot in a whole lot of different programs. For example, in Healthy PSU, we use stimulus response theory when we give people t-shirts for participating in our walking programs, or when they earn a new yoga mat for coming to our yoga classes for at least 3 months continuously. So stimulus response, rewards. If the consequence or the reward is reinforcement, we see an increase in behavior, such as being active or eating your vegetables or your fruits. If the consequence is punishment, then there is a decrease in behavior. For example, taking a medication that results in an illness when consuming alcohol. If the reinforcement is frequent, it should occur after the desired behavior, so there's an immediate prize. And this is where using incentives in various kinds of group programs, the reinforcement does have to be immediate. So someone attends a meeting, they get a door prize. Someone collects enough steps over the week, they get a prize right at the end of the week. So for stimulus response theory to really work, the reinforcement has to be close in time to the desired behavior. Complex behaviors have to be shaped in small steps. So for example, encouraging people to adopt a walking program. They need to be rewarded for little small changes that they adopt. Just tracking their steps alone with a pedometer, for example, if they were to track it one day at a time and finally a week at a time, and then gradually set some goals for increasing the number of steps, that would be an example of breaking down a complex behavior into smaller bites. So reinforcement and punishment can be either positive or negative. So if we look at the table of the stimulus response theory that's provided in the text, you can see that the increase in behavior, the decrease in frequency, and the consequences have relationships to each other. So when we talk about negative reinforcement, this uses elements that are not pleasant, so that when they're removed, there's an increase in the target behavior. For me personally, negative reinforcement is really important for maintaining my therapeutic exercise practice, because when I do my therapeutic exercise practice every day, my back does not hurt. So removing the back pain or less back and neck pain as a result of regular walking or regular exercising would be an example of negative reinforcement, taking away something negative. Positive punishment is the loss of something a person wants. So for example, loss of free time. Where negative punishment is the addition of something a person does not want, such as a spanking. A negative reinforcement or a negative punishment that's emerged in worksite wellness campaigns is if smokers actually have to pay a higher premium for their health insurance. That's basically a punishment, and it's negative to them because it's costing them more to be a smoker. So the efficacy or how these various uses of reinforcing elements work is really something that has to be looked at quite carefully. The application of this theory is relative to each individual and what they consider to be a reward or a punishment. So one person's punishment might be another person's reward, or vice versa. So in planning a behavior change program, we really need to know a great deal about what motivates our target audience to determine what will be considered a reward or a punishment. We can't just assume that what we think is a reward, everyone else will also think of as a reward. So in the theory of reasoned action, this theory explains not just health behavior, but all of the volitional behaviors. A volitional behavior is something that can be performed at will, or that you do voluntarily. And this presents a concept framework for the study of relationships among attitudes, belief, intention, and behavior. And it's a theory that's been used for years. And at the time that the theory was introduced, the notion that there was a relationship between the attitudes towards a behavior and what were the social norms was kind of new. I think we almost intuitively understand that now. And the idea that the intention to behave would directly affect the behavior was also new. Subsequent to that theory, the theory of planned behavior emerged, which uses many of the same components to explain people's intention and then resulting behavior, but it added the component of actual behavioral control. So looking at these elements, perceived behavioral control is similar to self-efficacy, or what a person thinks they can do. Actual behavioral control depends on skills, resources, and other supporting elements. For example, in the program we started this summer at Plymouth State University, it's called A Matter of Balance. The people who attend that program believe that practicing the exercises that are taught in that program will help them to maintain better control of their balance. The subjective norm that emerged in the class was that all the participants in the class felt that this was important to them, that it's something they wanted to work toward, and they really supported each other in practicing their exercises for balance control. Their perceived control had to do with how well they understood the exercises. So week after week, the exercises would be reviewed and practiced, and with more and more success developing for the individuals, their self-efficacy around these exercises increased, and so they had an increase in their perceived behavioral control, which influenced their intention to do those exercises. The actual behavioral control came into play when we looked at their real skills and how were they able to find a safe place to practice their exercises, begin to practice their exercises without direct supervision. So videotapes were provided and handouts and lots of partnering and reinforcement. So actual behavioral control is something that developed across the weeks of the program, which resulted in more and more people actually adopting this desired behavior. So that program directly applied the theory of planned behavior to help people adopt the new behavior of regular exercise for balance. So an extension of the theory of reasoned action, as I mentioned, talks about this idea of perceived behavioral control. Successful performance of the behavior depends not only on a favorable intention, but also on a sufficient level of behavioral control. And that's particularly important, I think, for programs that deal with older adults. This slide simply summarizes the health belief model, which is also a model that's been around for quite a long time and is used often in medical settings. It hypothesizes that health-related action depends on the simultaneous occurrence of three classes of factors. Number one is the existence of sufficient motivation or wanting to change, the belief that one is susceptible to the problem or the perceived threat, and three, the belief that benefits are worth the cost, or how big are the perceived barriers. So health belief model. People must also feel themselves competent or having self-efficacy to overcome the perceived barriers to taking on an action. So the constructs or the basic ideas of this model are that any kind of intervention that is based on this model would need cues to action. It would need to address perceived susceptibility. That would involve education. Perceived seriousness or the severity of the problem or the potential problem without a health behavior change, and that also involves education. the perceived barriers to a health behavior change. Barriers would certainly be individual barriers, as well as possibly socio or cultural or structural barriers, the perceived benefits that would come from a behavior change, and then the likelihood of taking recommended preventative health action. So I found kind of a cute video that I have hot linked for you here and also on our Moodle page that I would encourage you to view. It's a short 5-minute video that talks about the health belief model. So a health belief model can be used as a predictor of preventative health behavior. So if we're trying to get people to do things to help reduce their risk of heart disease, to reduce their risk of cancer, this is how this theory is often used. So it looks at the individual perceptions of the seriousness of the condition or the problem. It looks at modifying factors, the things that are influential, and it looks at the likelihood of action, or the likelihood of taking recommended preventative health action. So for example, for me personally, I had to face the phenomenon of high blood pressure when I entered menopause. And this was a real surprise to me because I had done just about everything possible to prevent high blood pressure prior to that point in my life. But looking at my individual perception of the susceptibility to the problems of high blood pressure, I have a family history of stroke and heart disease. And so for me, the susceptibility of problems was pretty high. The modifying factors had to do with my personality, my knowledge, again, the threat of a possible heart disease from high blood pressure, and then looking at advice from my physician and nurse practitioner, again, looking at illness of family members. So modifying factors were there and available for me, and it made it very, very likely for me to take action, which in my case was actually taking medication for high blood pressure. So if you look at these, the connection between these elements, it helps us to see what we need to plan in a health behavior change program based on the health belief model. The trans-theoretical model I mentioned is one of my favorites. It is an integrative framework for understanding how individuals and populations progress towards adopting and maintaining health behavior change for optimal health. And it has 5 major constructs. Number 1, that change happens in stages, that there are stages of change. And it's very interesting that this model parallels the buying cycle in professional sales. People go through stages when they're making decisions about, for example, buying a new car or buying a house, making some important financial decisions. So this model reflects the kinds of processes we go through when we look at making an important change. There is a construct that we describe as decisional balance, and that is how we look at the pros and the cons of change. At some point, the pros have to outweigh the cons in order for a person to want to adopt a behavior change. Self-efficacy for the new behavior needs to be addressed using this model. How well can the person actually make this new behavior happen? And what are the support systems for that? The processes of change, in other words, how do you actually do it? What do you actually physically or mentally do to make the change? And then what are the temptations or the forces that resist the new behavior, the things that might cause people to go into relapse and have to move back through the beginning stages again? So it's also based on 5 critical assumptions: that no single theory can account for all the complexities of behavior change. Hence, it's called the trans-theoretical model. It merges several different theories. Behavior change is a process that unfolds over time through a sequence of stages. We don't just go from one behavior one day to a new behavior the next day and it's a done deal. It's a process. Stages are both stable and open to change. Some things can happen that really lock in behaviors. Other things can happen that make it very difficult to change. The majority of at-risk populations are not prepared for action and will not be served by traditional action-oriented behavior change programs. And number 5, specific processes and principles of change should be emphasized at specific stages to maximize efficacy. So what we have available to us now are what we call stage-matched strategies. So depending upon where individuals are in their behavior change process, different interventions or different actions or different influences can be applied to match the stage of change in which they are in. So this process can work in groups, but we have to realize that within a group, people may be at slightly different stages of behavior change. So we have to apply intervention strategies to address different levels of or different stages of behavior change. So this diagram gives you two different pictures of the same model here. It shows one in a circular pattern and the other is more of linear pattern. I just kind of like the colorful one. So if we look at the first stage, which is pre-contemplation, that's a point where people do not perceive there's any kind of problem at all. And the only stage match strategy that actually works for people in pre-contemplation to help move them into contemplation is awareness raising, education. Or unfortunately, it's the stage where there may be a really serious health issue that emerges that finally gets them to go, oh, I maybe need to do something different. And as soon as that happens, the moment the awareness happens or the person really starts to think about the fact that there is a problem and something may need to change, they qualify for being in the contemplation stage. In contemplation, it's exactly that, thinking about it, thinking about, what are the positives or the pros about maybe doing something differently? What are the cons or the problems if I do nothing? So lots of thinking going on. Again, the only stage match strategy we have to use is education, awareness raising. The next stage is preparation. And this is the stage where someone actually begins to take a step or a movement or do something to begin to make that behavior change possible. My favorite example is the person who decides they need to get more physical activity, so they at least buy a pair of shoes for walking. Or they go on the internet and they find a pedometer to buy. Or they download an app on their cell phone to track their walking. They've done something. They've taken that first step to get ready. And we have some very specific stage match strategies for that level for individuals. And in preparation, it's also a time when assessment can be done and goal setting. Setting some very simple early goals and some basic objectives of that stage. Help people to visualize and then realize what it's going to be like to make this change. The action phase then is when they're actually doing the new behavior. But the new behavior is new, it's novel, they run into challenges. The pros of the new behavior outweigh the cons of not doing the new behavior, but it still needs a fair amount of reinforcement and support, both individually, at the social level, so at the intrapersonal level, at the interpersonal level, at the social context, at the community level. And a person does not qualify for being considered in the maintenance level until they have been in the action phase for at least 6 months. So this is a long stage, and it's a stage when relapse is very possible. And on the diagram on the right, when you see the arrows going up to the different stages, it's possible to relapse and have to go back to any one of those levels and go through the whole process again. So maintenance does not occur. We're not considered to be in maintenance until we've been in action for at least 6 months. And hopefully the behavior will persist, but if not, it may be necessary to go back to previous levels and redo the process. So looking at how to stage a person or how to determine what stage of behavior change they might be in if they were to come to your program, for example. And this would be an example around exercise. So simple questionnaire could do this, or a simple interview. Do you exercise regularly? Yes or no? If no, do you intend to be more active in the next 30 days? If no, do you intend in the next 6 months? If no, then they're in pre-contemplation. They really have no intention or no thought about being more physically active. If they've answered yes to intending to intend to be active in the next 30 days, then they consider to be in the preparation phase. If they answer yes to exercising regularly, and they've been doing so for more than 6 months, they're in maintenance. If less than 6 months, they're in action. So you can see from this dichotomous chart that by simply asking a few questions, you could stage a person and make some choices about what sort of interventions would work. So it is kind of important, if you use the stage of change model, to position your program so that it will attract people who would be pretty much in the same stage of behavior change. For example, it would be very different to offer a program, an exercise program, for people who are already exercising regularly and they're just wanting to do something new. So for example, if they've been going to the weight room for the last 5 years and doing strength training, and you want to introduce core and speed training to them, that's an entirely different program than if you're introducing people who are not physically active to the basics of an exercise program. And trying to mix those two people in the same group can be really challenging. So some of the processes of change that mediate progression are also indicated in this table 7.4. And this just kind of helps to see some of the different strategies that can be used as this continuum of stages progresses for people. I think it's pretty interesting in the action phase, this concept of self-liberation, which from my perspective means that people become able to participate in their new behavior without a lot of support, either from a professional or from their peers. So moving to the next slide, the progression adoption process model, the dog is barking, is more recent than the trans-theoretical model. It helps to explain how people come to the decision to take action and how they translate that decision into action. It is most applicable for use with the adoption of a new precaution or the abandonment of a risky behavior that requires a deliberate action. It can also be used to explain why and how people make deliberate changes in habitual pattern. And there are 7 stages. Now I've posted also a video on the behavioral science of behavior change, and you can see connections to this model in that video. So here's the diagram from your text. It's very similar to the trans-theoretical model, just slightly different in terms of deciding about acting, deciding not to, or to act. And some of the things that are likely to determine progress between stages using this model are a little bit different. From stage 1 to 2, the important issues would be media messages about hazard and precaution. Then we move into communications from significant others. This is, and you're going to see this on the video, when you actually have people that are highly respected that come out and speak about these issues. It might be the Surgeon General of the United States, it might be a celebrity, it might be your local physician or public health people. Then stage 3, 4, and 5 are looking at people's beliefs about the hazards. Again, this is a model about self-protection. And then finally in stages 5 to 6, we look at the time and the effort and the resources needed to act, and how-to information that has to be provided, reminders and other cues to action, and then assistance in carrying out the action. So this theory might be applied in a community action program, for example. So again, we have the process of staging someone using this precaution adoption model. And you look at the example of intentions for receiving the new vaccine for shingles. And so different questions can help to stage people. If they've already gotten it, bingo, they're in stage 6. I've decided to get it, they're in stage 5. I've only thought about it and decided not to get it. That's the decision to not act. I'm not sure, stage 3, I'm trying to decide. Oh, I heard there was a vaccine, but I haven't really thought much about it, stage 2. I didn't know there was a shingles vaccine, stage 1. So recently I have learned that there was a shingles vaccine, and I have decided to get it, but I have not gotten it yet. So there I am in stage 5. So I wonder, what is it going to take for me to finally act and actually go and get that shingles vaccine? Interesting to think about. So the final model we're looking at is the community readiness model. It's a stage change for communities. And if you were doing a large-scale program for a community, you could apply this model. Like individuals, communities are at various stages of readiness for change. So 9 different stages, from no awareness to professionalism. It's done, it's happening. And even if you can bring a community to the pre-planning and preparation process, this is the time when there is really a remarkable amount of funding available for communities to enact many different levels of influence for behavior change. For example, establishing a complete streets policy, which was recently done in Concord, New Hampshire, where the whole downtown area of Concord was reconfigured, redesigned to prioritize number 1, walkers, number 2, bicyclists, and number 3, cars. So the community awareness was raised. They went through an extensive pre-planning process for about 3 years. They set into preparation, got funding to make this happen. It has been initiated. The building has happened over the last 2 to 3 years. They haven't quite reached stabilization yet, and not quite into confirmation or expansion, but really poised for that to happen in the city of Concord, based on the community readiness model for encouraging walking and bicycling in town. So it also helps to determine the theoretical basis for your program plan. So selecting a basis for your program interventions, that's what this chapter is all about. And if you want just a concise review, see Table 7.8, which reviews the components of 12 different theories that are covered in the text. But I encourage you to just be simple with this. Choose a theory that you understand, that you think might work for your program. And if you have any questions, please feel free to write or contact me. Thank you. See you next time.